And lately, we've been seeing Paul kind of have this pattern where he goes into a Jewish region, goes to the synagogue, starts preaching to the synagogue about all this, and eventually rubs someone the wrong way, and then they kick him out, right? And then he goes to the Greeks. He's making tents and all that stuff. And he goes to the Greeks and tells them. And they finally ends up getting kicked out of the city in some way, right? And he goes to the next one. And that's how he's spreading the gospel. He goes first to the Jews and then into the Greeks. And that's working pretty well for him. And the story I told during the confession was about him in prison, right? And these people, we talked about it at length in Sunday school. I'm not going to go into it today, but they were so upset at Paul and what he was teaching and preaching that they went and got basically the mafia to come and deal with Paul, right? It says, you can look at it, it's in chapter 16, it says they got the bad people from the marketplace. Who are those, right? To go deal with them, right? And I think that's kind of the first mini lesson of today is don't let, just because you feel like things aren't going your way, doesn't mean that bad is now good, right? You can't hire the bad man to get things back going your way. All right, that's not Christian, right? And Acts specifically is talking about that. But after that story, we get Paul going into Athens. Now, I've had to explain all these other cities that Paul is going into. But I don't have to explain Athens to you. You know that Athens is a big deal. You know how I know that Athens is a big deal? Because I have to explain. The only reason why you know about Thessalonica is because it's in the Bible. Athens, they had an Olympics there, right? That's an important city. You know what's going on in Athens. So I don't have to explain that to you, right? That is like the cultural head of the Greeks. And Rome kind of has taken Greek culture and has encompassed it into itself. And so Athens is still incredibly important to the Roman Empire. It's still kind of the head of the learned there in Rome, right? That's where Plato, I wanted to call him Pluto really bad. I wanted to call Plato Pluto really bad, and that wouldn't be good. You know, the learned Disney dog Pluto, like that's the Plato and all those Aristotle, all that stuff was all in that area. And it's still that way even when Paul gets there. But as he's walking around through Athens, something distresses him. He sees something that he doesn't like. He looks around and he sees all these idols. He sees that the city is just filled with idols. And it bothers him. It bothers him a lot. And he kind of goes forward there, and some of the learned people, and we'll talk about them in a second, but they're the Epicureans and the Stoics. They come up to him and they look at Paul and they're like, you keep talking about all this nonsense, Paul. It sounds like you're picking and choosing from all these other places all over the world. Why don't you have a collective theory of yourself, right? Like, why don't you come up onto the Areopagus and talk about all these things? They basically invite him up to the platform to talk about these big, important ideas. And they bring him up to Areopagus. Now, Areopagus, by the way, Diane, good job on the pronunciation. She practiced for days. The Areopagus has a different name, much easier to pronounce. It's Mars Hill. Now, we got to talk about Mars Hill for a second. Now, that's not where they make M&Ms or Snickers or anything like that, right? It's not over there. We got this. Sunday school was able to get this. Let's see if the general crowd can do it. In Roman mythology, who is the god Mars? God of war. Good job. So think about what that is saying. That's Ares in Greek mythology. It's basically the same god to them. So think about what this is Mars Hill, right? What are they saying there? That is the God of War's hill, right? And that's also where it's the cultural center where they gain all their knowledge and all of that, right? What are they saying? The God of war, right? They're saying that warfare, that is how, that God of war, that is how we have our peace. That is how we have our wealth. That is how we have everything. Right? Like that's how we gain everything that we have is by this God of war. He's kind of their head God there, and they invite him up there to speak. And he says this. Let's see, where did I start this reading? Let's see. And Paul stood in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I can see that you're super religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully on your objects of worship, I found an altar with an inscription to an unknown God." So there's like an idol with an inscription to an unknown God. "So you are ignorant of the very thing that you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you, that the God who made the world and everything in it, the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples built by human hands. And he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else." Before we go on and talk about this, I want to go back and I want to hit this inscription here. So he goes, "I walked around, I even found an altar, found an idol. It says, to an unknown God." Fascinating, right? I get three things from this. And the first thing is, I'm going to tell you all three right off the top here. The first thing that I see is, I think this reveals us a lot of times. And I think that sometimes we're terrified that we're going to miss God. I think it reveals our own nature, that we're terrified that we're going to miss God or miss salvation in some way. I think also that it also says that rather than avoiding culture, Paul uses their culture to tell the story of redemption. And the third thing, we've got to watch our manufactured gods. We've got to watch out our own idols. Those are the three things I kind of saw from this one little thing. So I want to talk about the first two really fast. The thing I think that surprised me the most when I became a pastor, and still am, the 11th is my ordination anniversary. So this is like 8 years right now. Like, hey, yeah, clap for me. All right. I just figured that out right now. So I've been a pastor now for 8 years. And I think we're worried, and the thing that surprised me the most as being a pastor is the amount of people that are worried that they're missing out on God. They're worried because I haven't done the right thing, or I haven't done this, or I haven't done that. And like that tears me apart, because Jesus says that like the whole like idea of God is that rest, don't worry, rest. It's the amount of people that are just terrified, and they will set up altars in their own hearts to these other gods, hoping that they can find salvation in that. They're so worried about their salvation that it works their hearts into a frenzy rather than just being able to rest. And when I started seeing that tears my heart up, because I want you guys to be able to rest in the grace of God, right? And the second thing that I noticed here is that he does something that we often don't do. He doesn't avoid their culture. He embraces it to have it tell the story of redemption. It seems so often, as soon as someone says something that's against us, we're like, oh, can't touch that anymore. This company said this certain thing about this little thing, and now we got to boycott that company, right? Like, we do that constantly. Oh, like they said something about us Christians, can't be part of that anymore. Right? Like like the culture's going away from us. It's so weird and backwards to me to respond like that. Because we see Paul embracing where the culture is and using it to tell the story of redemption. The church has such a rich history of doing this. It does. We got two things that are right in front that we stole from other cultures for our own use. Can you think of what they are? They're huge. Christmas and Easter. Coley hears me talk about it all the time. Christmas and Easter. Christmas and Easter. Think about it. Now you've had some like probably atheist friends or something like that. And they're like, Christmas isn't a Christian holiday, or Easter's like Saturnalia or something, or that Christmas is Saturnalia and all that stuff. Because think about it. Think about Christmas, how we celebrate Christmas. Where in the Bible does it say that we should cut down a tree and put it in our house? Now think about this. This is what crazy people do. They cut down a perfectly good tree, right? And they haul it into the house and then like decorate it and all that stuff. They don't have it in a planter. No, it's nothing like that. It's cut off and it's sitting in the house for this one thing, right? That makes no sense. The only reason why it makes sense is that everyone in this room did it last year, right? That's the only reason why it makes sense. And it's nowhere in the Bible. But think about what that did as Christianity was moving up into the Celtic regions. Moving up from the Middle East in through Greece and Italy, coming up through France and Spain and into the Celtic areas. They started seeing these cultic ceremonies. And they saw this one where they were celebrating, when doing things with evergreen, that when the night is the darkest, right? When the night can't get any darker than it is, when the winter is in full force, they bring in something green and say, it's going to get better. And the church came in and said, when the time seemed the darkest, God brought light into the world in the form of his Son. And the church said, you guys are already getting together and celebrating this. Let's make it be about this Jesus. Cool, huh? They also did it with Easter too. I think it's kind of odd that Easter's right at that point in between, right when spring's hitting, right? Like right when spring's hitting, when everything's sprouting out of the ground and coming to life. Does that sound like anything? Right? Like so they take this thing, it's like, oh, because Easter, where is Easter in the Bible? The word Easter. It's not. It's a relation to an old Celtic deity. But the church came in and said, you guys are already getting together. And we celebrate Christ who died in the death of the winter that was past, but come from the ground, just like those Easter lilies and all those things, and rose again to bring new life to us all. They took what their culture was and they sanctified it and made it holy. And it's good and great. Let's continue doing it. I don't know where it needs to be done right now. My nephews are in here today. They play Pokemon. Maybe it's that with Pokemon, right? I don't know. But maybe we figure out ways that we can be like Paul. They're like, I see that you are really into gods, and you're even so worried about this other gods that you're going to miss them. You have this one. Well, let me tell you about that one. And all that. And then he says, and then he goes on this full thing that says, watch out for your manufactured gods. Watch out for your idols. Watch out for, and I know what you're saying. You're like, you've heard probably multiple sermons on this, right? About idolatry and all that stuff. And I get lots of questions from people that are like, well, what is an idol? What is that? Like we don't have idols today. None of you like get home and bow before an image of something. I mean, none of you go home and immediately bow down before the TV, right? And watch and watch hours upon hours of 24-hour news, bow down, waiting for the great deity in the TV to tell you what to think about something, right? Oh, maybe that was a little too close. None of us do that, right? Like that. None of us do that. We don't like do that with newspapers or all these images, right? Like none of us do that. Like we don't bow before these idols at all. Like these, and what's interesting is remember how Paul described himself? He said he was the Hebrew of Hebrews. To a good Hebrew thought that through the creation, God showed his creative ability. God said that through the creation, God showed his grace and mercy. He showed his creativeness through that in creating all the days. Remember, he created everything through all those days. And then at the very last day, at the very last thing he created, remember what he said? He created Adam, right? But what does Adam mean in Hebrew? You guys know this. It means man, Adam. He created man. And then what did he do with man? He breathed into his nostrils. But you remember ruach, right? In Hebrew, that word ruach, it means breath, but it also means spirit, and it also means wind. And so God spirited into his lungs. You can also say God winded into his lungs, but that may not be the best translation. But God spirited into him and filled his lungs with the Spirit of God, with very life itself, right? And brought Adam to life. And then what did it say? After Adam is taking those first breaths, which just, when you breathe, it almost sounds like you're saying Yahweh, right? Yahweh. Right? Like it's almost like you're saying the name of God each time you make a breath. And he breathes, his lungs fill, and he's filled with the life of God, and God does something else. What does he declare? He declares, we made him in our image. What in the world does that mean? To be in the image of God. To a Jewish individual, they understood that the light that God breathed and created in us all. That he created in us all and breathed into us and made us into his image. And that image now reflects the godly nature of creativity and gracefulness into the world around. I think, I could be wrong about this, but I'm not. But that God's image, that we as God's image, we reflect the nature of God into the world around us, which is his creativity and gracefulness to everyone around us. Think about what Jesus says when he's talking about the Sermon on the Mount. That's Jesus reflecting God's very nature into all of us. Blessed are the poor in spirit, right? Blessed are the meek. Blessed are all these things. Think about the Lord's Prayer, that when we pray that God's kingdom would come, that his will would be done on earth just as it is in heaven. We're praying that we reflect the very nature of God, his creativity and his gratefulness all around us. That we'd be a part of that we'd be his very image. And what Paul is saying to those people on Mars Hill is that you guys have this idolatry. You have all these idols, and that idolatry, it diminishes God in you, but it also diminishes your own humanness. That when we begin to serve the idols in our lives, when we begin to serve those manufactured gods in our lives, we begin to lower ourselves down. We begin to lower our own humanness down. That's why God sent his Son, who was the perfect human, who perfectly reflected God into the world, to come and die and rise again so that he could take the cuff of his sleeve and buff our mirror, our reflective disc out, and make us shiny again, that we may reflect on the whole world. Paul points out multiple times all these Roman gods. I think it's the god, I may be pronouncing it wrong, but Bacchus. which is the god of wine, you know? And Paul talks all the time about getting drunk. And he's talking about bowing down to that God and it diminishing your reflection of God in the world around you. He also talks a lot about Aphrodite, right? The god of sex. And he says when you are improperly using that, you're diminishing your reflectiveness of God into the world around. When you go into those temples and have the orgies and all of that stuff, when you're participating in those idols. And then, where is Paul? He's sitting on the Mount of Mars, right? He's sitting on Mars Hill, the god of war. And he says, when you are exalting and making war and loving it and bowing down to the images that are only used for control, power, and wealth, you are diminishing your reflection. And he brings Jesus to us. And he talks about how God is with us. And I have to go away from my sermon right now. Because you know how you write some things and then something else happens and it ends up being so much better? Well, Sunday school happened. You guys should come to Sunday school. And I realized something when I was teaching Sunday school. That Paul, at the beginning of here, and I think we talked about it. It's here. Oh, where is it at? Anyway, I don't actually have it on here. These people that we called them the learned folks, that they were the Epicureans and the Stoics. You guys ever heard of Epicureanism? Oh, yeah, all right. Good stuff. The main idea behind Epicureanism, and Stoicism is kind of part of this too, is that God is far away and basically is hands off on you. I think the author of Acts is wanting us to get put in our heads to know this, that the reason why Paul is going up to the God of War's hill to talk to them about the God is because those that believe that God is distant and nowhere near you, is that they are the ones that are bringing him up there. And Paul's entire thing he talks about is about, it's the God that is close to you. On top of Mars Hill, the God of War's hill, he talks about the God of the living. Like, did you notice that? He says right here, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples built by human hands. He is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, but rather he himself gives everyone life. And look at what he's saying, and breath and everything else. That was earlier in the sermon when I was doing all the breathing stuff. He gives himself life and everything else. That this God is not the God that is far away, that you have to create things out of your own self to feel like God is close to you. That you have to create, that you have to work real hard in order for God to be close to you. No, he is saying that God is right there all the time, and he's always bringing life to you. That no matter what you feel like you have to do, no matter what you feel you have to say or do anything, that God is the God that is right there. That he is with you. And that when all seemed lost, God sent his Son, where? To right here. And we tried to kill him. And he says, but he couldn't stay dead. He still stayed right here, so much so that he sent his Spirit on to us all. And he's right here amongst us, involved in everything. So when you feel doubt, when you feel like God isn't near you, when you were worried about the culture around you, rest, because God is close to you. Don't worry about having to make those idols of whatever they are in your life. God is near you, and he'll never leave you or forsake you. And I think that's good news, and we'll end right there.